So far, we've passed through some difficult times and places, and we've wrestled with some even harder ideas. Today, I hope to take it from the vague past and make it real. We'll begin a stark assessment of the very difficult and dangerous world of ideas that you will inevitably face out there. In our next and last lectures, we'll finish it up and find out that it isn't all doom and gloom. To mash up two wise quotes from Tolkien, "The world is indeed full of peril, and there are many dark places, but there is still much that is fair. Oft hope is born when all is forlorn." As dark and meaningless as the world around us has become, the gospel gives us hope. Now, as we dive into this, there are several important philosophical truths that we need to bear in mind. If you don't understand these points, it can be very easy for impatient Americans to miss the central ideas. First is the fact that it often takes time for these ideas to mature in a culture and bear their logical fruit. The first generation that pioneers an idea very rarely carries it to a consistent conclusion. That generation grew up with what you might call moral guardrails that stop them from going to what they would call too far. For example, Darwin might tell you that you're an animal, but we have to wait roughly half a century before the eugenics movement and the Nazis really start to act on the idea by managing people like herds. That's important because when you study various philosophers, especially current ones, right where they are, people will often jump to the false conclusion that since we don't immediately see disastrous effects, that no such effects are forthcoming. It just takes time. And by the time people can really and clearly see how bad things have become, the original ideas themselves are often already accepted as normal and even positive by the larger culture, making it difficult for them to accept the connection. Second, people will also jump to the conclusion that since they or someone they know wouldn't personally carry an idea too far, that it must mean that there are no reasonable people who could. Unfortunately, all that often means is that some people have more residual moral guardrails than others. You might think of it like a trigger on a gun. You yourself may have been taught gun safety, and so you would never pull the trigger. But your aversion to pulling it in no way prevents the trigger from being pulled by other people who don't share the same background. Therefore, as we think about these ideas, keep asking yourself, is there any logical and consistent reason inside the idea or worldview itself that would prevent an intelligent person from going there, wherever there might be? Now, you can't answer because that is evil or everyone knows not to, because in doing so, you're looking at an external moral system of rules, and the worldviews that we're going to be talking about deny the very existence of morals. So, doing so is no answer at all. If you feel yourself saying, "Well, that's wrong just because, and other people will know," resist it and follow the logic where it leads. Then be prepared to watch how the ideas affect people and cultures over a longer period of time, decades at least. For ideas that came out in the 1900s, we are really just now fully and completely in a place to really understand what they meant for the world. And sometimes there's just not enough time to be able to know what would happen for sure. A truly new idea or worldview combination that you see today may not be fully and completely played out until long after you and I have passed. In those cases, you have to rely on logic in order to predict what's going to happen. When we last left off our story on this path to insanity, we had said that the Enlightenment and Romanticism had left us empty. Humans need both meaning and truth to genuinely live a significant life different from animals, and the 1800s had created a world where neither was really possible. For a time, culture indulged in false alternatives like a blind belief in reason or science or progress, but by the second half of the 20th century, these had all been revealed to be insufficient at best and essential frauds at worst. Going into the 1900s, Many people optimistically thought that science and progress would bring about a perfect world, to find a cure for all diseases, end all wars, and draw everyone out of poverty. And then World War I hit and killed an entire generation of European men in only a few years. Then the Great Depression came roaring in, which, rather than bringing about a wonderful new world, ushered in the Nazis, the fascists, and the Japanese imperialists. All of that brought us to World War II and the Holocaust, with millions more dead. It ended with the invention of an atomic bomb and developments in chemical and biological warfare that had the potential to wipe out all life on the planet. Rather than solving everything, the whole world seemed to be worse. Poverty, inequality, racism, disease, all of it. By the 1960s, certainly, all the progressive promises of the past 2 centuries were ringing hollow. But where do you turn when you've cut off your own nose to spite your face? What do you do when there's nothing left but despair? Nietzsche had seen this coming, and hence his Superman had been forced to resort to the will to power and become what he would call an egoist. His answer was that if there was no God to give you meaning, you simply make yourself a god, and then shake your fist at the pitiless universe and will your own meaning. This emerged into an idealistic worldview called modernism that thought that this meant that humans as a whole, as societies, could progressively define their own truth. Humans would make things better and better because humans were essentially good. But then that series of disasters hit and people lost all hope in humanity as a whole. People felt betrayed by humanity, science, and all their empty talk of progress. They began to trust no one but themselves. Beginning in earnest with the postmodern movement, each individual person was supposed to define and create their own realities. Literally, you have your truth and I have my truth, and the only real sin is one of us telling the other that we might be wrong about something. In this view, truth and meaning aren't simply relative to humanity or even to society, but to specific individual people and their specific individual points of view. The result has been an incredible splintering of Western culture into thousands of bickering little shards. Looking at our 2-point analysis from the slide before, we see that there's very little difference in effect between socially created meaning and self-created. Both are based on mist and moonshine. Someone just declaring something true or assigning random meaning to a thing, whether that someone is you or I or society, in no way actually affects that thing or makes it true. It still emerges as a mere game of pretend with different trappings. Declaring myself to be a millionaire in no way makes me one. If society gives me a plaque to that effect without giving me $1 million to go with it, it makes me no more a millionaire than I was before. I can pretend that I feel like one as much as I want, but eventually reality will set in and I'll find that I genuinely have no money. It is a simple absurdity, and anyone who is looking knows it. In that moment, how likely is it that my declaration, or even a plaque, will hold off honest despair, if I'm hungry and have no money? Further, enough time has passed now to see that the effects of this idea are developing into what you would expect from the logic, with the highest suicide rate in national memory, and a generation willing to perform even self-mutilation on themselves and others in order to extend the failing falsehood. Very few people seem to be satisfied by any of it. In a very real way, we have come full circle back to the beginning of the year. This is precisely what Milton's Satan was asking for and what the biblical Satan offered Eve. People believe that their mere word, the knowledge of good and evil, create reality for them in the shape that they want it to be without regard for God or objective truth. We can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven if we like. In doing so, we are attempting to usurp God's power and prerogatives. Sadly, as we saw with Milton's Satan, his desire to think of hell as heaven didn't change his circumstances, nor will it lead to anything but despair for those who emulate him. I find that for many of us who have grown up inside a Christian community, especially in some places in America and Europe, It can be very hard to grasp the fact of where we are as a society. So, one last time, I will beg your patience, and I want to look over the whole process and take it further in a few key places to connect it up to today. Thankfully, we've already covered much of this before, and so we should dispense with several fairly familiar faces quickly. One person who probably won't be very familiar to you is at uppermost left, and that's the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831. I wish we had more time to spend on him, because his effect on your world is pronounced. Do you remember all the way back in the fall when we talked about the two changing views of truth? The first one said that truth was based on an objective reality, which in turn was based on God. So, when you wanted to know something is true, like whether water boils at a certain temperature or whether the sky is blue, you can check it against outside reality. So you heat the water to that temperature and see what happens. If it boils, good, you can form your opinions on the matter to that external reality. If it doesn't, then you change your mind the other way. Hegel was the guy who invented that other version, dialecticism, which said that human thought doesn't necessarily conform to an outside reality. He said that you start with a thesis, you counter that with an antithesis, and from the two you get a synthesis. That synthesis then becomes a new thesis, which you counter with a new antithesis, and the process repeats itself. The most important point for us, and for many philosophers that followed him, is that at no point in the process does any of this have anything to do with an external reality. There's nothing to check. There's no outside to make sure whether you're right or wrong. Just thesis, antithesis, synthesis, over and over. Everything means whatever the participants say it means. Therefore, the truth, quote unquote, isn't connected to outside facts and certainly not to God. It is wholly determined by humanity. If that sounds obscure, apply it to our example. Our understanding of the boiling point of water in this view isn't connected to an outside fact that can be tested and known. It's all connected to our own opinions and determined by biased people. So, water might boil at different temperatures depending on your perspective. While Hegel himself would probably object to that, in short, when we take his ideas at face value, it sets us up for a world without truth in any meaningful sense. Karl Marx came next, and he built on Hegel's foundations explicitly. His haves and have-nots were openly based on Hegel's thesis and antithesis. He boiled all of human history down to the communist dynamic, and in doing so, he eliminated all meaning and value to traditional history. People's actions aren't determined by their choices or their wills. There is no meaningful story in the actions of individuals or nations. It was all controlled and determined by materialistic, atheistic causes, dynamics like simple chemistry. That being the case, there is no need to study history, and in fact, Marx himself claimed that after the communist revolutions were complete, we would reach the, quote, end of history. Marx, therefore, gives us a world with no past and no history. Darwin came along a little after Marx, and while Marx was not a direct influence on him, when Marx heard of Darwin's theories, he was ecstatic. He loved them, and he told his people to promote them. Why? Because Darwin created a world without design or value. Every human and all human societies were simply vague accidents with no point and no meaning. Humans are animals, materialistic creatures tearing into one another in pursuit of evolutionary perfection, whatever that was supposed to mean, regardless of morals or significance. You might actually want to pause this for a moment and really let it sink in about what that would actually mean if it were correct. How different would society be? Not a single aspect of life would be left untouched. And then there was Nietzsche, the brilliant mind who took up all the pieces and saw what this all meant. Nietzsche gave us a world without God and without transcendent meaning, truth, or ethics. He created a topsy-turvy world where evil is good and good is evil, and only the Übermensch would have the strength to rise above it all, and we see how the Nazis tried. As the 20th century dawned, new peoples and philosophers were ready to build on this shaky foundation. They took the blind faith in human progress from the Enlightenment in Marx, atheistic materialism from Darwin, and Nietzsche's will to power, and they created a new movement, modernism. Humanity was going to shake off the chains of tradition, God, and religion, and they literally believed that they were going to make a perfect world by the end of the century. Now, this is where it can get a little confusing. For most people, the word modern simply means new or up to date. That, of course, was what the modernists meant you to think of. They were going to be the final word on culture, creativity, science, and philosophy. No one would ever be more modern than the modernists. This is where humanity was quote-unquote meant to go, though by whom they were never really clear, and where we were all meant to arrive and achieve a final realization of humanity itself. It gets confusing, though, when modernism proves to be just as fickle and short-lived as any other human philosophy. What do you do when modernism itself is old and out of date? Well, we'll get there shortly, but for now, just remember that in this context, the word modern also refers to this specific philosophy, not just what's quote-unquote new. The central thrust of modernism was the human race and human progress. Humans as a whole truly defined and determined truth and reality. If a human thought it or willed it, it became so. A leading proponent of this was French philosopher and author Jean-Paul Sartre. He proposed a worldview called Existentialism. Building upon Nietzsche, Sartre, an atheist, recognized the void in meaning and value that atheism had created. He wanted humans to be able to have religious feelings and religious experiences without the pesky necessity of having a God to create them. He addressed it by saying that while there was no objective meaning in the world, subjective meaning could stand in the gap. So, while your life really was meaningless in the universe, you could make it mean something by your choices and your experience. On a practical level, instead of turning to God, humans turned to humanity itself and asked for meaning and truth. Now, of course, there was no actual value to anything that humans said or did, and no truth in their ideas. But through an act of will, you could make yourself feel like there was. So existentialism focused on two key elements. First, it said that since there was no meaning, all actual meaning was illusory. It therefore looked to expose the hypocritical absurdity of life and truth in the world. We saw movements like Dadaism pop up with an emphasis on the ridiculous. They liked to mock society, religion, the church, and anything that was considered to be a settled truth in the hopes of upsetting the cabbage cart and getting everyone to see things from their point of view. Secondly, existentialism encouraged people to create their own truth and meaning. People were sent on visionary quests to find some personal, subjective, validating experience that would give meaning to their lives and value to their non-existent souls. For example, someone might travel overseas or climb a high mountain or engage in extreme charity, trying all the while to make themselves feel real or significant. The idea was to provoke some powerful emotional experience that could give you the impression of bigger value and meaning. And therein lies the rub. Simply having the impression of a thing is not having the thing itself, like my millionaire plaque. Even if, for a time, people felt like they had meaning and value, in reality they didn't. It wasn't long before the emotions wore off and people came back down to earth to the harsh reality that their life was no more meaningful after they climbed the mountain than it was before. You can only play the game of pretend for so long before you want something more real, and existentialism simply could not provide it. Sadly, it couldn't even provide the illusion of meaning for long. This void led future philosophers to keep asking the question, if all life is absurd, why do we pretend that it isn't? Modernism brought with it an overwhelmingly positive view of humanity and human progress. Most modernists were in some way optimistic for the future. Think of Nietzsche and Sartre. Through an act of your will, you can find meaning, truth, beauty, power, and even mystic, quote-unquote, religious experiences. But is that what the 20th century actually delivered? Certainly not. Progress had brought 2 world wars, massive death tolls, and widespread destruction. The constant threat of nuclear death pressured everyone, and the hard leftists and Marxists, especially in academia and the arts, became increasingly angry, increasingly cynical, or both. In any case, the older, human-centered progressive view of modernism became much less attractive. What grew up in its place was a movement called postmodernism. We shouldn't be surprised to hear that much of postmodern thought developed out of French culture. The French intelligentsia had largely lost their moral foundations all the way back with the French Revolution, and the country had spent the 1800s in chaos under the Napoleons. Finally, they lost a war to the Prussians that led to the rise of modern Germany. In the 20th century, all of the Western Front meat grinder in World War I was on French territory, and millions of French young people were killed by it. And then they lost the entire nation as a whole to the Nazis in World War II. If ever there was a people who had been ground down into plain cynicism about the promises of progressive society and modernism, it would have to have been the French by the 1960s. They were primed for an extreme reaction. While postmodernism itself is a very, very diverse thing, at its heart it is a simple and complete rejection of truth and meaning, making everything relative to the opinions of the person speaking. So, postmodern theater is theater without any rules or truth. Postmodern ethics are ethics that are completely determined by opinion. Postmodern architecture is building with no regard for rules or style. As you might imagine, then, it can appear radically differently depending on what particular area of culture you're looking at. One of the most important postmodern pioneers was Jacques Derrida, who created a system of thought called deconstruction. You may very well have heard of a sort of bastardized version of it that's been making its way through popular evangelical circles these days. Derrida believed that language had no inherent meaning and that it was really just a random system of symbols signifying nothing real. Thinking on it from the perspective of the previous slide, that should make perfect sense. With no outside objective reality and no God to serve as the foundation of meaning, what is a word? A word is just a squiggly thing that one animal created and associated with a certain set of sounds, which it then associated with a certain thing in this world. What makes a horse a horse? Why not a cheval or a caballo or a paillard or a hest? As Christians, we can reply that because God has the ability to imbue genuine meaning, humans can too. But if there is no deeper grounding in reality than Darwinian accidentalism, the answer has to be, well, there's nothing. You can call a horse a gobblethunk if you want, and it has just as much meaning as any other word that you can apply. Further, since words have no actual meaning, we cannot expect others to reasonably understand them. Language itself has no meaning and no power to communicate ideas accurately from one person to another. Now, why is this important? It is because if you adopt these ideas, you've given up your ability to reliably interact with anyone around you or anyone who has gone before you. Even if there was truth to discover, you could never know it because the medium through which the truth was communicated is completely unreliable. If language has no meaning, then anything you find there must come from outside sources, like a person's background, their biases, and hidden cultural beliefs. Thus, we arrive at the process of deconstruction. When we hear someone say something, we're supposed to take it apart and find out what that person really means. The problem is that on this view, people mean only what we want them to mean. And so it usually quickly degenerates into a mess of politically charged word games. So when someone says, "the sky is blue," it's really just a mask for their latent racism against colored folk. The words have no actual meaning, they have no actual value, and so since they don't point to real things, what they do is point back to the speaker. They point to deeper psychological issues in the speaker. Now, in practice, people don't equally apply this. For example, a deconstructionist will write books and give lectures and talks about how language communicates nothing, obviously ignoring the fact that if that is true, then what they say must be equally meaningless. They will then deconstruct someone else's statements to expose the inherent racism and bias, which in many cases is completely imaginary, while expecting other people to accept what they themselves say at face value. The end result is that another bedrock necessity of human culture and society is torn loose from its moorings. We have no reason to trust our ability to communicate. Michel Foucault is another important French philosopher and author who helped birth the postmodern, and afterwards, critical theory, which we'll look at in our next lecture. A contemporary of Derrida, Foucault takes things even further. He is known as the father of post-structuralism. If we begin with the assumption that there is no truth and no meaning, that means that humans and human society are simply deterministic animals and the product of deterministic animals. It then follows that no explanation of reality, no history, no story, no religion, could ever be true in itself. So if anyone is offering to explain the meaning of the world or your place in it to you, as a Christian, as a Buddhist, as a citizen of the nation of France, or of the nation of the United States, he or she is obviously lying to you and trying to manipulate or even oppress you. Because all of that is meaningless, so if we actually talk to you about it, we're talking to you about nothing. Instead of truth, Foucault substituted what he called narratives and meta-narratives. Any story that someone claimed was true was a narrative, and any grand story that claimed to explain all of reality, for example, Christianity or Buddhism, was a meta-narrative, or a really, really big narrative. All were assumed to be equally false. Foucault believed that these kinds of stories were intentionally used by abusive majorities to keep minorities in line by giving them reasons to believe that the world was okay. Foucault's answer was simple: smash them all. Better you take control of the narrative and you use it to write a new narrative and destroy the ones you don't agree with. So you rewrite the narrative in popular culture to make your enemies look bad, make yourself look good, and if you have to wholesale lie to do it, why does it matter? There is no truth to lie about, so there is no such thing as a lie. There is only power, and you use that power to enforce your will and your worldview and your narrative and your structure onto the world. You've seen this practice live in your own education, very likely, when you learned versions of history that make the United States, for example, look like nothing more than a demonic racist utopia where nothing good or valuable has ever happened. In any given nation, good and bad things have happened. So if someone presents a single nation with absolutely no good people or no good coming from it, they probably have an ulterior motive. This is one of those narratives being used to force you into a certain opinion. The goal is to control the story, and in doing so, control what you think about it. And if they control what you believe about the story, they can control the way you interact in your world and your actions in it. It quickly becomes complex and messy. But the important thing to remember is that this worldview isn't just academic. It has intentional, real-world applications and is meant to directly influence society, culture, and politics. And like with deconstruction, post-structuralists are selective in their application. No story has any meaning or truth, except the one we want you to believe. When they tell you what they think, they will treat it in practice like a form of absolute truth, and to question it is to question the virginity of Mary to the Catholic Church. But any other narratives are simple and inaccurate human inventions, devoid of any truth. For example, try suggesting that there could be any negative consequences to the LGBTQ+ lifestyle on social media. You're likely to be hated, ostracized, and sometimes even banned from the platform. On the other hand, all manner of negative comments about traditional religions or political parties are treated as perfectly normal free speech. It's insidious and dishonest, and if you aren't on your guard for it, you will be a victim of it. The expectation in all this was that having been twice freed, first from the oppression of religious truth and then from the oppression of truth altogether, that the world would move swiftly into freedom, progress, and joy. And perhaps you can understand that expectation. Probably more than a few of us personally at this moment feel uncomfortable thinking about the implications of this thing called truth. If there is such a thing, then it affects us in powerful ways. First, many people loathe the idea of conflict, especially interpersonal conflict. Gotta admit, I'm one of them. We don't like to argue or dispute with other people. We just want peace and for everyone to be friends and get along. That's especially true in today's world where many of us have never been taught healthy ways to work through disagreements. If truth exists, then some of us are right and some of us are wrong. That inevitably leads to conflict with other people. Worse, if truth is bigger than us, we are essentially morally obligated to hash it out to the end on important issues. How relieved and even excited would we be to discover that none of that matters and that we can simply avoid it all. We're all equally right, after all. Another reason why people would be more than happy to find out that truth didn't exist is that if truth is real, then it has a claim over us. We can't just make up our minds to believe whatever we want to believe. We have to conform ourselves to it. For an inherently rebellious and fearful people like ourselves, that is simply unacceptable. If I want something and I think it will make me happy, who are you to tell me any differently? The very idea of sin, for example, that some things are right and others are wrong, is an offense to that kind of thinking. So finding out that there is no truth, no right and wrong, that I can be or believe whatever I feel like I want to, is once again a huge relief. I don't have to conform myself to someone else's standard, let alone God's. Surely we can understand how that would be attractive. The actual realities, though, are much harsher. Truth does exist, and reality is objective. The position we see emerging at this point is a literal self-refuting nonsense. To even say that there is no truth is to really say the truth is there is no truth. To put it another way, the objective fact I demand you believe is that there are no objective facts. The only thing we can't tolerate is intolerance. You may have actually heard that one directly. And all through it, we're using language to say that language means and communicates nothing, except our own, of course. So, while for a time the prosperity and technology of the post-war West allows people to play at a giant game of pretend, eventually reality does and will catch up. Rather than resulting in less hatred, we see as much as we did before, perhaps even more. It's just that since it's culturally justified, it's now okay to hate certain people or certain groups because they quote-unquote deserve it, people pretend that that doesn't count. It isn't hatred. Rather than coming together, society has splintered into an untold number of factions, each with its own view and agenda. Rather than bring peace, it is easier than ever to justify violence. Disrespect and abuse is skyrocketing across Western nations, enabled by social media, and as we said, suicide rates are through the roof. No new sense of lasting meaning or significance has emerged, and in fact, perhaps most frightening of all, the moral guardrails that have traditionally kept most people from doing some of these awful things have progressively come down. After all, if morality is just opinion, and my opinion is that hurting and stealing from someone else will benefit me, why should I care that you don't like it? Most of this failure seems to boil down to the completely unrealistic views of human nature held by many secular thinkers from the Enlightenment onward. As far back as Rousseau and others, they assumed that humans were inherently good, and that given the chance, they will do good things. So if you take down all those protective walls of morality, if you let people do whatever they think is best, they will do good things naturally, or so the theory goes. And so they proceeded to tear down human culture and pull it loose from anything that held it in check or to whom humans were held accountable. Unfortunately, as the Bible has told us clearly and history has manifestly demonstrated, human nature is anything but positive. It is fallen and corrupt. The end has been increasingly disastrous. Which brings us to our next to last set of readings for the year. Thankfully, while it is important to directly read and understand where philosophy, literature, and science are going wrong, it's equally important to study the genuine truth, the light that it sheds on the world's evil, and the alternative path that you have the opportunity to follow. So while we still have some crazy in store for you, we'll also look at some of the best Christian thought that is pertinent to our world today. And that leads us to a key question. What exactly makes a story or other literature Christian? Some of us tend to think that it must have some overt stamp of God's approval. For example, it must use churchy language or directly quote scripture or integrate specific altar calls like the end of a church service. Now, it is certainly true that some Christian literature does exactly that, and that's fine. I don't want to cast shade on or discourage those kinds of efforts. That said, in much of American Christianity, we have somehow got it into our heads that this is the only kind of writing that glorifies God or that we can call Christian. I would submit to you that the very best goes beyond that. Think about Christian music. Much of what is made by that definition isn't really very good or original, is it? It's mostly whatever the world did 5 years ago with lyrics rewritten into Bible verses or praise choruses. On the contrary, music or literature is Christian when it naturally flows from a Christian worldview and its themes, lessons, and details are in line with biblical truth. That means, of course, that it can be entirely and thoroughly Christian and never explicitly mention God or even Jesus by name. As a prime example of this, consider Lord of the Rings. It's a powerful and intentional Christian work of art that flowed directly from Tolkien's Catholic worldview, and it has affected millions of people and multiple cultures in profound ways for the gospel. It has improved and deepened the faith of many and set up others to really understand the desire for truth, and it does all this without ever preaching a sermon or invoking a praise band. Works like this manage it by evoking a very old truism, that of show, don't tell. Instead of yelling at people what they're doing right and wrong and what they should and should not believe, they create images and worlds in which people can experience the differences directly. Fyodor Dostoyevsky, who lived in Russia from 1821 to 1881, was just such an author. He was a serious and profound Orthodox Christian from a very young age. While he did not always approve of priests in the church, his love for Christ was enthusiastic and evident throughout his life. That love shines through his works. This fact is sometimes lost because his novels are often considered so great, some of the very best in all of world literature, that other non-Christian traditions have tried to lay claim to his legacy and effectively de-Christianize his ideas. Existentialism, not the least of these. We'll be reading The Brothers Karamazov, which was intended to be the first in a series of books on its hero, Alyosha, but sadly Dostoyevsky died before he was able to write the next installment. That's helpful to remember because while you will encounter scenes and characters that seem completely random and even pointless, it's very likely that Dostoyevsky intended to make more of them and take them further in later books. This book has been called the greatest Christian novel ever written, and you should be on the lookout for specific themes that he intentionally added. The tapestry he weaves is intricate, and we can't possibly begin to examine every thread now. But there is one in particular that is key to the book and Dostoyevsky's reputation of atheism. In many ways, the book is a study in the results of killing God and erasing the idea of truth. Many of the worst consequences of the book spring straight from this theme, and his analysis of it is strong. That's obviously a direct refutation of Nietzsche, the postmodern, and the will to power, and it's made all the more brilliant because Dostoyevsky foresaw their coming decades before they arrived on the scene. Miss Flannery O'Connor is another, more recent example of a strong Christian writing powerfully impactful stories, and also one who many in the church don't fully understand. From Milledgeville, Georgia, she lived from 1925 to 1964 and sadly died young at 39 of complications from lupus she had inherited from her father. She was a devout Catholic and had sought God specifically to grant her the ability to write really good stories that reached people. From her still large following of Christian and non-Christian readers alike, it seems that prayer was answered. She wrote several novels, but is often best remembered for her short stories. Most famously, A Good Man is Hard to Find. She is credited with pioneering the entire genre of Southern Gothic. I personally find that while her stories are full of life and humor, they are also usually not lightly read. That is because she has a strong sense of purpose, and she confronts her reader with the very harsh, dry, and evil side of human nature in Southern culture. Many of her stories are dark, and more than a few are frankly brutal. If you invest yourself, even stories you thoroughly enjoy can exhaust you. But you rarely leave them unimproved. You almost always walk away a better person for the experience. All of that contrasts very sharply with the Christian definition of literature we mentioned before. If you believe that Christian literature is all sweetness and positivity and light and happy salvation messages, you may find it hard to see Miss Flannery as a Christian author. If so, I'd encourage you to look deeper. In order to really understand and appreciate the light, you need to have seen the darkness. And displaying that darkness in human nature and human culture is something that O'Connor excels in. To put it another way, before you understand salvation, you must feel like you need to be saved from something. In her writing, O'Connor brilliantly and wittily highlights the evil and pettiness in human nature, and in doing so creates a felt need. You can see the sins of her characters very clearly, and in doing so, you can connect them to the failures in your own soul. From a Christian standpoint, these issues are essential. The reality of evil you and others commit is a powerful repudiation of moral relativism. If there is no right and wrong, there can be no sin. If there is no sin, you have no need for salvation, and Christianity ceases to make any sense. O'Connor excels in making her reader feel the sin of her characters, and through them, the sin of humanity. Sin is real. These people need saving, and so do we. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, of course, a giant in the civil rights movement. Virtually everyone knows his name, and most of those people virtually idolize him as the man who could do no wrong. They refuse to listen to any criticism of him. On the other extreme, others have started to find out much more about his more, shall we say, seedy and sinful personal life, and then they push him as a complete fraud. The truth is much more complicated. He was a fallen, sinful human being who accomplished great good, but also hypocritically inflicted some significant evils. He fits into our class as a great illustration and an example of the struggle over civil rights in the United States that Miss Flannery so brilliantly illustrated in her Southern Gothic. His Letter from a Birmingham Jail is a good example of King's complexity. On the one hand, it is a brilliant call to action for a kind of civil disobedience that seeks to be very sure that it is justified and even biblically inspired. On the other hand, it isn't entirely what it pretends to be. King didn't spontaneously write the letter in prison. In fact, he wrote it before the protests and took it with him, expecting to be arrested. It was, in that sense, a meditated public relations ploy. On the other hand, it also provided a clear step-by-step plan for when and how to engage peacefully with a corrupt and oppressive culture and government. It makes some of the themes we see elsewhere very real indeed. But that cultural evolution growing out of Nietzsche's nihilism and the failure of progressivism was still present and accounted for. As we've mentioned, after the two world wars finally crashed all that unjustified secular idealism, postmodernism emerged to replace it. Postmodernism isn't so much of a party or an organization as it is a vague cultural tidal wave that sweeps across the West and leaves virtually nothing untouched. There isn't a single leader who plans things out. It's more of a collection of different pioneers in separate fields pushing postmodern ideals on their own. It started in the humanities and spread out from there. Eventually, there was postmodern art, postmodern music, postmodern education, postmodern architecture, postmodern literature, postmodern theology, postmodern cinema, etc., etc., etc. When it hit popular culture, especially in mass media like Hollywood, TV, radio, and government schools, it became a sort of secular counter-gospel focused on transforming all areas of life into the secular paradigm from the ground up. Today, there is virtually nothing left untouched. In fact, you yourself have probably absorbed some of its attitudes without even realizing it. Postmodernism may be all over the place, but the closest we can get to a central point or ideal is that of moral and cultural relativism. There is no truth or meaning, so each individual creates it for themselves, and each person's truth is as good as any other's. This is different from the earlier modern ideas of relativism, because whereas before society and countries could create viable truth in their own pursuit of progress, now no one can find it outside of the individual person. Before, human progress and science could make grand truths that everyone could and even had to agree with. Now, each human being is literally a tiny god who creates their own reality. There is nothing but force and power that can compel someone to agree with anything. That's why postmodernism can look completely unrecognizable from place to place. The results of relativism in, say, literature might look completely different than relativism in theater, for example. It fundamentally contradicts some areas of study like science or history, but they do it anyway with dangerous results. To get us a feeling for and an understanding of that moment, we could look at Derrida or Foucault or others and it would be instructive. But probably our biggest help will be this man, playwright Samuel Beckett. As an instructor, I find that students can memorize propositions about postmodernism, but the biggest problem I see is getting people to believe that it's real, that people actually believe it and try to live it out. It is, in some cases, quite literal insanity, and if you've grown up with any kind of sense around you, you have a tendency to look at it and say, "No way someone actually believes that." Well, they do. Beckett's infamous play, Waiting for Godot, is a great example of what it looks like in practice. It is literally a play about nothing. Nothing happens, and there is no narrative and no significance to anything. Its only point is that there is no point. It means to communicate that meaning and communication aren't possible. And if you point this out to them, they'll likely just laugh and agree and be proud of themselves. Rather than extrapolating what all this might look like, Beckett shows us. And the result is the effective death of the play. You grasp all there is to grasp from it in the first 5 minutes. The rest is an effective experience of nihilism. Nothing and emptiness and repetition of nonsense in time wasted. It is also inevitably the death of the larger culture. Philosophies like postmodernism only work for a short time. You can think of it as similar to economic socialism. Socialism, or communism, can have an appearance of success in societies that are still mostly capitalist in nature. The motivated capitalists overproduce, and that gives the socialists something to redistribute. They give the wealth to passive and unmotivated people who mainly use up more than they contribute. For a time, then, the system seems to work because the overproduction offsets the passiveness. But what happens when most people become socialists and lose their motivation to contribute? The surplus disappears, there is nothing left to redistribute, and the system falls apart. So it is with postmodernism and moral relativism. While the majority of the culture maintained a working moral framework and a de facto belief in truth, which results in honesty, hard work, objective science, value of human life, faithfulness to friends, nation, and family, etc., etc., people could talk about there being no right and wrong and still have a functioning society around them where they could expect to be safe and for people to be straight with them. Further, the wealth and technology built up by previous generations in the West provided a cushion against reality. You could blabber on about utopian idealistic wealth redistribution when there was plenty of money and food on hand. But what happens when a generation or two pass by and many fewer people have those moral guardrails anymore? As we'll see in our final talk, the results won't be pretty.